Hello, and welcome to my week at the club. As you may recall, we're in the final round now of the annual championship of the Wachusett Chess Club in Fitchburg, Mass. And as I left you last week, I had 3.5 out of 4 points, tied for the lead with Ray Paulson, who also had 3.5 out of 4 points, since we had both drawn our game against each other and then won our other games. So in the final and fifth round, I was on board 2. I was paired against Ken Gurge, who I have played a number of times, and I was black in this particular game. And it started out with Ken playing pawn to king 4, so e4. Now, this was a bit of a surprise. Our last several games, he had played d4, and so that's what I had actually prepared for this round, and so he kind of won the very first battle. I responded with e5, a double king pawn game, which is a good solid way to play it. I don't always play this, but it's something I play fairly frequently. He attacks the pawn, I defend it. Of course, this is all very well known. This is the Ruy Lopez or Spanish opening, where the bishop comes out and threatens to trade off the knight and put pressure as a result on this e4 square, e5 square rather. I kick the bishop with the pawn, make it either move or take the knight. If it retreats, as he did, then at some point in the future, this pawn on b7 could be pushed up to b5 and have an immediate freeing influence if for some reason I need this knight to be unencumbered. So that's the reason for that move. Now, the last time Ken and I had played this line a couple of years ago, he actually took my knight on the fourth move. So we're into new territory here. This is after my move, d6, this is modern Steinitz opening, or modern Steinitz variation, really, of the Ruy Lopez opening. Okay, Ken played c3. This is pretty much the main line of the modern Steinitz. Now, black has a couple of different alternatives here, actually probably 3 good ones. Can play f5, which is a very combative answer. Another idea is to play bishop to d7, which is a very slow positional approach to it, unpinning this knight that's pinned and threatening at some point for the knight to move, and with a discovered attack on the bishop, that sort of thing. And the final thing that black can do here is to actually do what I did, and that's to play knight f6. There are some other possibilities, but these are the 3 main choices for black. The point here, of course, is that I'm attacking this pawn that's undefended and is a little awkward to defend right now because he just put his pawn here on the most obvious square for the knight to go to defend the pawn on e4. Again, there are some choices here for white. What Ken chose was actually a quiet positional approach, which is also probably the most popular. And these sorts of positions come up commonly in the Ruy Lopez, and they also come up in the Italian or Gioco Piano game when white chooses to play d3 instead of the sort of more open d4. And it ends up being a positional maneuvering sort of game. White often maneuvers this knight over to his king side by that route. And he amasses pieces over here on the king side and hopes to put pressure on black's castled king. So black has one of the drawbacks of the modern Steinitz is that you have this solid pawn chain here, which is good for maintaining the strong point at e5. This pawn on d6 defends it. But the drawback to it is that it blocks in your dark squared bishop, and either you have to develop it here at e7 where it's doesn't have many prospects, or you can do as I did and fianchetto and eventually develop it at g7 where It still doesn't have many prospects, but at least on G7, it exerts a calming influence on white to keep him from feeling quite so happy about pushing this pawn to D4 at some point, because then that would open up my diagonal for my bishop. So it does have some purpose, and of course it's got to get out of the way if I ever want to castle. Castling queenside is difficult in this variation. So white went ahead and castled. It's no problem for him. I fianchettoed. He played the rook to E1, which makes sense, controlling the central pawn, and of course, as a result, freeing up the this pawn on D3 here, which is currently defending the E pawn. Now he's freeing up that D pawn to go forward at some point in the future. I castled, no surprise there, and he played his B knight to D7, to D2 rather, starting out with that knight maneuver that I talked about, bringing it over to the king side, and temporarily defending the E pawn as well, but that's really not much of a consideration here because the knight almost always goes quickly over to the king side. I decided it was time to gain some space on the queen side and also to release that pin on my knight, so I went ahead and played the B5 move to chase the bishop away, and he went back to C2. That was a minor surprise to me, although it turns out this is the best, or the most popular square according to Master's opening play, opening theory, if you look at the games. But it's also fairly common for the bishop to go instead just to B3, which is sort of what I expected, for him to put pressure along this light square diagonal. Instead he goes to C2. That's also good because it reinforces this pawn at E4, although it does, its prospects are not so great because of this fianchettoed pawn formation that I have. Means that it will be hard for him to, even if the central pawns open up, he's going to be biting on granite over here with my strong pawns on the white squares. I fianchettoed my light squared bishop. I think that's probably the only reasonable place to develop it here. As I've said in other, I believe I've said in some of my other videos, developing it, once you fianchetto, developing a bishop where it pins the knight really doesn't make sense unless you're prepared to exchange that knight off, or if you really want to induce a weakness by encouraging them to play, say, H3 in this case, and then you drop it back to the square you really want to be on. In this case, the bishop makes sense on B7. Okay, so Ken went ahead and continued with knight to F1, repositioning it over to the king side. And I played sort of an unusual move. It's basically it's the first move that gets us really out of opening theory. And my logic for this is that in double king pawn games, black, if there's a kind of a saying or an aphorism or whatever, that if black can get in D5 in a double king pawn game without immediate bad consequences, then he's succeeded in equalizing. And so, you know, that seemed reasonable to me. I looked at D5 here and I couldn't see how it could be immediately punished. So it's fairly aggressive, but I went ahead and played D5. And the computer agrees. It doesn't think this is a bad move. It gives white a few tenths of a pawn advantage, maybe 3/10 of a pawn or so. He went ahead and exchanged that pawn. I took back with the knight. And then he continued bringing his knight over to the king side. At that point, I played F5, and this is meeting fire with fire or something. He wants to play on the king side, and often white will play instead over on the queen side, but I chose not to in this position. And the reason for that is that I have the two pawns on the fifth rank here, or my fourth rank, on E5 and F5, that are quite mobile, and either one might end up being pushed at some point in the future. because of the great control that white has over e4, it's looking a little less likely that I'll successfully get that in. But certainly I am free to go ahead and push this pawn, the f pawn to f4 at some point and attack his knight. But that currently would leave a gaping hole here at e4. So it's not something I do immediately. But it does signify that I'm willing to play on the king side here as well. He took advantage of this in some sense and developed the bishop out to attack my queen in order to say that I'm weakening these squares in around my king. And I think that's a reasonable point of view. But the problem is that I was able to just move my queen like so and complete my development, have my rooks connected. And now I'm actually threatening at some point to push my f pawn forward. And when I do so, his bishop is in danger, is trapped, because at that point it's trapped because this pawn can go forward, the bishop can move back, and then the g pawn goes forward and the bishop is lost in there. Interestingly enough, I might not want to do that even if I can, because it weakens my king side so much. And this comes about, interestingly, in the variation a little further on in the game. But Ken instead played bishop back to d2. He decided that it was time to get out of dodge and get onto a safer square. And I was glad to see that, because it really represented he spent 2 tempi getting from his original square back here on c1. He went out and then back to d2. So he took 2 tempi to get where he could have gotten in 1 tempo, and I could argue that my queen's actually maybe a little better on d7 than it was on d8, where it was blocking the development of my rooks. At this point, I took time out to put my king in the corner. I was concerned about this open light square diagonal. With my king on g8, there's always the danger that the bishop can go to b3 and pin my knight. And if that happens, then at the very least, he can force a trade of that knight. And there are even some other possibilities for tactics based on that. So it seemed like a good time to take a little time out and put my king into a safe, tuck it into a safe spot there in the corner. That's one of the drawbacks of playing an aggressive move like f5 like I did, is that you really weaken yourself along this light squared diagonal. And often when you do that, you need to take an extra move to play your king to the corner to make it safer, and even so, it's not as safe as it would have been if you'd never moved that pawn. So after I put my king on h8, he played a move that was a surprise to me, but it was actually a very good move. It's the computer's first choice, and that's h4. So, he has quite a bit of firepower on the king side. He's got both of these knights. He has the dark squared bishop already pointing over there. The light squared bishop is going to be bearing down on it as soon as that pawn moves, and the queen is also threatening at some point to come over along that diagonal and join in on the attack. So he's got a lot of firepower, and it makes sense for him to go ahead and open up some more lines on my king side. And all of a sudden, he's the one who's attacking on the king side. So that was quite an interesting move, I felt. And there was really no way for me to prevent him pushing that pawn to h5. So I just played my rook to centralize my rook to the e file. Actually, let me step back a moment here. I could have, of course, played this pawn on h7 up to stop the pawn from going any further, but that didn't appeal to me at all, because then I would have had this enormous hole on g5 that his knight would have come into, and it would have been very hard to get it out of there. So instead, I played the rook to the e file, as I said. He continued on with h5, threatening to open up a file. And after quite a bit of thought, I played bishop f6, which is kind of a oddball move. It's not one I wanted to make, because I didn't want to impede my rook's activity along the f file. But it seemed to be necessary in a lot of the lines that I looked at. So what I kind of really wanted to do at this point would have been to play my knight over to f6, but if I do that, then this pawn comes forward and my bishop would be trapped and it would be lost. So I couldn't play knight f6 immediately. So instead, I got the bishop out of harm's way, and at the same time made an escape square for my king to go to on g7. So the idea is maybe after a pawn trade, hg, that my king could come up to g7, and like so, and then my rook could come over and be active along that h-file. So that was the thinking at any rate, and so that's why I played my move. It turned out though that things unfolded a little differently because he played the bishop out to attack my rook, and I didn't expect that move. And it's not a bad move, but it's a little it's weak. It's not too good because it ends up taking up some more time, and in particular, it allows me to play my rook to the file that's going to get opened. And that right now, since he put the bishop on h6, there's no way he can avoid the pawn trade if I want to trade pawns, and I'll be able to open up this file for my rook on the g file. So he went ahead and took my pawn, but this sort of plays into that whole strategy because now I just go ahead and take it back. So, what would have been better probably at that point would be to make a different move and say, okay, black, go ahead and take my pawn on h5. I'll be able to take back, white will be able to take back on h5 with my knight, and now you've just activated it and brought it in on the attack, have it attacking the bishop and these dark squares around the king. So it might have been a little stronger in that case to make a different move, but instead he went ahead and exchanged the pawns at g6. So I take back, the problem is I take back with the rook. Now his bishop is under attack. He has to do something about it, and I'm threatening to double rooks on the g file. If he plays queen to d2, which is looks like it's a reasonable move here, defending the bishop. Problem is I can push my f pawn and block off that diagonal, and now the bishop is still trapped and is going to be lost over there on the queen side. So instead, he retreated the bishop once again back to d2. So, there have been 4 moves now with that bishop, and it represents a bit of a loss of time because in the meantime, I've developed my rook and queen to squares that they're more active on. So this gives me time to double my rooks now in the g file, and all of a sudden it's black's attack on the king side that's looking very dangerous. And in particular, if this f pawn comes forward, this knight might have to move, and if the knight moves, of course, there's a fairly deadly looking check on rook takes g2 check. So that's not so great for white. And he came up with a clever move, okay? So I was not expecting this move, and didn't really examine it, but basically it involves a piece sacrifice. And what happens after my expected response, I think, by him, is what I did, was to go ahead and play e4. I thought this was going to be very good for black, but of course what he has in mind here is to sack a piece for 2 pawns. And now normally sacrificing a piece for 2 pawns is is a loss of material, but it's in the position that we were in. So if we go back a little bit, back before he pushed the pawn, in this position, he's getting squeezed to death on the king side, and it's it's only a matter of time before black's attack, if he keeps going along these lines, is going to succeed on the king side. In fact, I already missed a good move here, which instead of playing rook to, instead of doubling the rooks immediately, it would have been strong for me to, at that point, to play f4. And I didn't do that because I was too worried about this knight maneuver. The knight would come into this hole on e4, and then it'd come over to this other weak square on c5, and now all of a sudden it's forking my queen and my bishop, and my queen would have to drop back and defend the bishop, and all of a sudden he's gotten an initiative. Except I didn't really look at this line clearly enough in my analysis, because after the knight goes to e4, then black can simply double the rooks. And white doesn't have time to go ahead and continue on with that knight maneuver attacking my queen. If he does, for example, what happens is rook takes pawn check, the king goes to f1, it's even worse if he goes to h1, and now the queen comes out, and there's mate and 4 more moves. So that's just an example of what could have gone wrong on the king side if white waited around for too long. Instead, I doubled rooks, and that gave him the opportunity to go ahead and make this pawn break in the center, which encouraged me to keep from opening the line for him in the center, the counterattack in the center. Of course, that's a classical strategy. When somebody's attacking on the wing, on the flank, then you counterattack in the center. So that's why white would make that pawn break. And I would try to sidestep it by pushing my pawn by, but then he sacrifices. And the thing that's good about this is now he's changed the character of the game. And even though he's down material, he's got activity for his pieces. And all of a sudden I started to worry a little bit about getting my pieces coordinated. In particular, my knights and my bishop were kind of tripping over each other. I really wanted to open up this diagonal for my bishop, but I had to get my knights to some squares where they would do something useful but still not be in the way of the bishop. And I was afraid if I moved this, in particular if I moved this knight that's on c6, that his knight is free to come in and attack my queen, and I didn't really want to trade off my bishop for it, and so on. So that's why I didn't go into that line. So instead, I chose what was definitely not my strongest continuation here, but I thought that I should perhaps get rid of this pesky rook that's on e4, offer the trade. Of course, he didn't trade it. I would probably have taken back with the queen if he had. Instead, he defended it with his queen. It would have been a little stronger in view of what happens later if he had defended by bringing his queen to e2 and controlling this file. Instead, the queen is a little awkward on c2, and at some point I make use of that fact along this light square diagonal. So I repositioned my other knight that's not doing too much currently on d5, and in order to start to threaten to unleash the power of this bishop along the diagonal. And he doubled up his rooks on the open file, which is a reasonable move. And I decided it was time to trade off a pair of rooks. And he took with his rook, and that's perhaps not as good as having taken with the queen. It looked aggressive. I mean, he certainly is, this rook now at some point could come over here to h4. I can't do it immediately because of this bishop, but after the knights or the bishop trade off my bishop, then his rook could get very active over here on the h file. But it does put it on an awkward square where this undefended queen is stuck behind the rook along this light square diagonal. I played my queen up to d5, which didn't have, it was a move that I think I made because I was having a hard time coming up with a good alternative, but it doesn't have a lot going for it. It's just centralizing my queen. And it did did keep him from using h5 for his knight, which is certainly a plus. But the computer suggests instead of playing the queen to d5 to deploy this knight over to a5 and come in with it, threaten to come in on c4 with the knight, and at the same time it opens up this the bishop's attack along the diagonal, which, you know, in retrospect is a good looking move. I didn't see it though, and so instead I played the queen up. So at this point, after I played the queen up, he defended with the pawn to b3. And I was happy to see that, because after I played the queen up, it's true that I'm attacking this pawn, the a pawn over here, but I wasn't really interested in taking it, because I felt at this point that my chances were on attacking on the king side, or at least repulsing his attack on the king side. We're both sort of going, you know, head to head, toe to toe over here on the king side, and it would be, I think, wrong strategically for my queen to go off and go grubbing for pawns on the queen side, because all there is really one pawn there to grub, and not much more. I could get a check on the back rank, but there are, you know, a variety of ways he could block that check. It's really not that dangerous of a check, and I didn't really feel like detouring with my queen. So basically, him playing b3 here gave me an extra tempo, and I used that with a combination, right? So in this position right here, I played rook takes knight, and the idea was this was a pawn structure wrecking combination, is what I considered it. That is, I wasn't trying to win material immediately, but I was trying to get a big positional advantage by wrecking his pawn structure. It turns out that actually he, in the short term, would win a little material, but the computer likes this sec very much as the computer's first choice as well. And what actually happened was he made a fairly catastrophic choice here for his game. But what he should have done, which I'll show you first, would be to go ahead and accept the sacrificed rook. My plan then was to continue with knight to b4, attacking the queen, and at the same time discovering a second attack on the rook. And the queen has to move, or the knight has to be taken. So he takes the knight, then I play rook takes queen. And so this was the position I saw in my head. And the material, we've exchanged a pair of knights and a pair of rooks, but he has played this pawn capture, which doubled up his g-pawns and isolated them, and this pawn capture, which did horrible things to his queenside pawns and left this d-pawn about to be captured. I didn't realize in my analysis, though, that if I'd gone one ply further, that he does have queen takes c7. So actually, one could argue I'm a little behind in material, although there's I could recoup it immediately if I wanted to by playing bishop takes d4 check. Although I have to be a little careful that my minor pieces don't get picked off by his queen. Overall, this is still good for a couple, you know, an exchange, an advantage of about -2 pawns or so for black, but it's still much better for white than what he did do. The move I was afraid of when I played my original combination, after I played rook takes g3, and I looked at it for a while, was c4. I thought that he might be able to play this move, chasing my queen away from the rook and causing me just to lose material. But then I realized I could play in this event, I could play my queen to f5, and now this is where that pin comes into play, where I'm pinning the rook along the diagonal, and there's just no good way to unpin the queen. And you know, if he moves the rook, the queen is lost. If he moves the queen, the rook is lost. It's one of those kinds of pins. It's just very awkward, and I'm going to end up winning this rook, and with a totally dominating position after he takes mine, say, and the knight moves. Now I'm hitting the rook twice, and this is just very, very, very bad for very bad for white. So he wouldn't want to do that. So instead, instead of all that, he took my knight on e7. And this doesn't work out at all well for him, because if I took the knight back immediately, it'd be fine, and then he'd take, if I took his rook back rather, it would be fine, and then he would take my rook back. But there's a Zwischenzug here. I can play rook takes pawn check, and that makes all the difference, because after I take the pawn, he has nothing better than to retake with this king. If he moved the king to f1, then I would just play rook takes f pawn check, or if he goes to the corner, that's very bad, because he's, I could play knight takes rook, and all of a sudden I've got a deadly attack going along this light square diagonal, because of the bishop and queen lined up. Whoops, wrong diagonal. Bishop and queen lined up along this long white diagonal attacking the king, if the king were on h1. So he has no choice at this point, other than to do what he did, which is to go ahead and take my rook, and then I take his rook back. And now the problem for him is that I've got this pin along the light square diagonal, and the knight is going to be lost. So he can defend it, and it's defended twice, and my original idea was this, when I was analyzing this line, was to go ahead and exchange off the queen and the bishop for the queen and the knight, and just to play with the extra piece. But then I realized I could get even more, so I played my knight up. It turns out that this is not black's strongest continuation. Black's strongest continuation at this point, according to the computer, and I agree with it, is queen to h5. And what happens here now is I'm threatening to come in with the queen to g4 check, and actually win the knight with a mating attack. And in order to try to stop that, he has to play his bishop, or he can block that check. I check anyway, he blocks it. I take I don't take anything there. I play my bishop to e4, chasing the queen off of that diagonal. It has to drop back to a weaker position there, where the knight is pinned now. And then I play the knight up, and I'm threatening knight into f4 check. It's just horrible. So it would have been very bad if the computer were playing. It would have done that. Instead, I played queen f5. This is still good though, because it's going to allow me to win the knight on f3. So he brought the bishop out and attacked this undefended pawn that's on c7, but that's fine. I'm not worried about that pawn. I went ahead and took the knight. The computer thinks it's again stronger to in this position to actually check with the knight, and to try to make a mating attack with my pieces. But when humans are playing, it's a good thing to get the queens off the board and get it to a position you can win. And it doesn't matter whether or not you're winning by 8 pawns or 16 pawns or whatever. You've got to get it to a position you feel comfortable with, which is what I did. It's a very forcing move. I take here, he has to take back, otherwise the queen is lost. And then I just simply fork the king and the queen. He moves the king, has to move the king somewhere, and since I have 2 attacks on the queen, it doesn't matter if he comes up, it's just not defended enough, and I'm able to win it. And at this point, I'm 2 pieces up. We both have, well, I have 4 pawns, he has 5, so I'm a pawn ahead, and actually after his next move, he's 2 pawns ahead. So it's 2 pieces for 2 pawns, but it's still a very easy win. There really aren't any drawing chances, because black can trade off a pair of minor pieces and all the pawns, and then with the bishop and knight, checkmate the king, or with the 2 bishops, if that's what it ended up being. So it's a pretty straightforward win, and this is going a little long, so I won't take a lot of time discussing it. So I just brought my king up to get it a little more active. You want to activate your king in endgames. He doesn't have a whole lot of choices on what to do. He wanted to push his queenside pawns, but I have the pawn on on d4 totally under my control, and so even defending it doesn't help. I went ahead and started pushing the h-pawn because it's going to be very hard to stop it from getting up to h1. He went ahead and pushed his pawn. That allows me to exchange it off and then win the d-pawn. Okay, he came back to the dark diagonal to at least try to keep the h2 square under control, but at some point I'll be able to block his control of that square and be able, or you know, at worst have him sacrifice a piece in order to try to keep that pawn from getting in. I went ahead and pushed it further, and at this point, it's if you analyze it with Stockfish, the advantage for black is minus 14 pawns. If you go out to depth 27 ply, so 13 and a half moves. And so that's up to move 51 or 52, something like that. And it decides the h-pawn is unstoppable, and that's what Ken thought as well. So he chose this point to resign in the game. Meanwhile, on the board next to me, Ray Paulson had quite a superior endgame against Arthur Barlas. He wasn't ahead of any material, but Arthur had a horrible bishop trapped behind his pawns, and also Arthur was behind on the clock, and in trying to make some fast moves to keep from losing on time, he unfortunately lost a piece, and that game went, well, unfortunately from my point of view, and from Arthur's, I guess, lost a piece, and so Arthur lost that game to Ray, and so Ray won his game, so he and I each ended up with 4.5 points, and as a result, we were the co-champions for this year. So there wasn't any tie-breaking algorithm, or we didn't have to do a speed chess playoff or anything like that. Instead, they were just declared co-champions. So it was a happy result from my point of view, and I'm sure from Ray's as well. And I'm glad to be able to bring you the action this year for all 5 rounds. I hope you've enjoyed the quest, and I apologize a bit that this is such a long audio, but it was an interesting game, and it was the decisive round, so I wanted to give it to you in all of its glory. So until next week, this is Roger Capello signing off from the Wachusett Chess Club. Goodbye.